The echo of carriage wheels was muffled by a damp November mist, the kind that seemed to swallow both sound and breath. It was 1895, and the city of New York stood still for a moment, as though it sensed the unfolding of a spectacle it had long been promised. St. Thomas Church loomed ahead in its Gothic solemnity, its spire blurred by the cold air, and there, moving toward it in ivory silk and a heavy lace veil, was Consuelo Vanderbilt. She walked not as a bride carried by joy, but as a figure propelled by the expectations of two continents, each step heavier than the one before. Behind her, unseen but always present, the shadow of her mother's will lengthened like a winter afternoon. My friends, before we open this story fully, I invite you to leave in the comments the time of day and the place from which you listen, so that we may imagine this as a great tapestry woven across distances and generations. And if you wish for more journeys into lives once gilded and now dust, you may press the subscribe button, so that these voices of history may reach you again when night is deep and the world grows quiet. That November morning in New York began with a silence too measured to be peace. The air inside the Vanderbilt mansion was thick with the scent of white roses, chosen for purity, though their perfume seemed almost oppressive, clinging to the fabric of the hallways. Servants moved without a word, their soft steps lost beneath the slow toll of a church bell somewhere far down Fifth Avenue. Consuelo sat before a tall mirror framed in gilded carvings, but she could not seem to focus on her reflection. Her face appeared pale even against the ivory of her gown, and her eyes, large and dark, seemed to look not at herself, but through the glass, past the room, into some unseen place. The gown itself was a marvel of Parisian craftsmanship, layers of silk satin falling like water, the lace veil pinned so precisely that it gave the impression of having always been there. Yet she wore it as one might wear armor, ornate, beautiful, but made for battle of another kind. Outside her chamber door, voices rose and fell. The careful instruction of her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, her tone brisk and precise, the occasional shuffle of guests arriving earlier than expected. A marriage between a Vanderbilt and a duke was not a private matter. It was an alliance, a statement to the world that wealth and title could be bound together like strands of gold in a chain. Alva entered without knocking, her presence filling the room more than any floral arrangement could. Her gown was darker, heavy with beadwork, her gloved hands folded around a fan she had no intention of using. She surveyed her daughter not with a mother's tenderness, but with the practiced eye of a general reviewing the readiness of a soldier. "You must not keep him waiting," she said, though her voice lacked warmth. It was not the Duke she feared to offend, but the order she had so meticulously constructed, a place for herself in the rarefied air of old-world nobility. Consuelo rose as instructed, the silk of her skirt whispering against the carpet. In that moment she thought of a letter that had arrived weeks earlier, one she had hidden in the desk by her bed. The hand that had written it was one she knew as well as her own. The words spoke of love, of a promise once made under the shade of a summer trees. But promises had no power against a mother's command, especially not in the house of Vanderbilt. The letter lay unopened, as though refusing to confront the reality of its own futility. The carriage awaited at the front steps, its lacquered surface reflecting the gray of the morning sky. As she stepped into it, Consuelo felt the faint vibration of the horses shifting, eager to move, perhaps unaware of the weight they were to carry. The city outside was damp, the streets glistening with the residue of a night's rain. Faces turned as they passed, some curious, others reverent, for the spectacle of wealth marrying into nobility had a power that no newspaper scandal could tarnish. The church rose before her St. Thomas, with its stone facade weathered into softness, its great doors standing open like a mouth ready to consume. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with wax and evergreens, the hush broken only by the shuffling of guests finding their places. The Duke of Marlborough stood at the altar, his posture impeccably straight, his expression composed, if not entirely warm. He was a man bound by his own set of duties, and in that, perhaps, they shared an unspoken kinship. As she walked down the aisle, the white roses from her bouquet seemed heavier than they should be, their stems cutting faintly into her gloved hands. The organ swelled, its deep notes rolling through the high arches of the church, yet the sound seemed distant, as though coming from another place entirely. She thought of the life awaiting her across the ocean, Blenheim Palace with its endless rooms and echoing halls, its history embedded in every stone, and the eyes of England upon her every gesture. The vows were spoken, the ring slid onto her finger, and a murmur of approval moved through the assembled guests like a ripple across still water. But in her mind, there was only the sound of paper, the folded letter in her desk, the unopened envelope that would never be answered. It was not rebellion she felt, nor even sorrow, but a quiet, enduring detachment, as though the self that had once been Consuelo Vanderbilt had already stepped aside to make room for the Duchess she was now required to be. When the ceremony ended and the carriages once again carried them through the city, the streets had begun to clear. The mist had thinned, but the air still held the weight of an overcast day. She looked out through the glass, watching the buildings pass in blurred succession, each one seeming more distant than the last. Somewhere in the folds of her gown, a single white rose petal had fallen loose, resting against the silk as though reluctant to leave. That night, the reception glowed with the light of countless chandeliers, the music drifting in gentle waves from the orchestra. Guests spoke of the grandeur of it all, of the historical significance, of the merging of fortune and heritage. But Consuelo, standing at the center of it, felt herself as an object more than a person, admired, displayed, yet untouchable. As the evening waned, she slipped away for a moment to the edge of the grand ballroom, where the scent of the roses was strongest. It was there, in the mingling of perfume and candle smoke, that she felt the day settle heavily upon her shoulders. The last guests departed, the music faded, and the house grew still once more. In the quiet, the fragrance of the flowers seemed even more intense, almost cloying. She stood for a long time by the window, her gaze lost in the street lamp's dim glow against the mist. Somewhere beyond that veil lay the sea, and beyond the sea, the life she had been promised to. She did not yet know the shape it would take, only that it would be vast, cold, and unyielding. And still, in that moment, she could almost hear the faint rustle of a letter being opened, though her own had never been. The fragrance of those white roses lingered as she closed her eyes, and it drifted her backward in memory toward a garden she had once known not as a woman, but as a child. In that garden, the roses were not cut and bound in a bouquet, but still rooted in the earth, their blooms turning gently toward the light. Yet even there, beauty was something to be kept under watch, for the high walls of the garden were not meant to keep danger out so much as to keep its treasures in. The Vanderbilt mansion at 665th Avenue rose behind it in a grand, unbroken facade of pale stone, its windows like polished eyes, observing all who passed. Inside, the house held a stillness that was never quite silent. There was the steady rustle of skirts along the hallways, the almost imperceptible tread of gloved servants' hands setting porcelain cups onto trays, the muted tick of clocks in rooms lined with damask and gold leaf molding. As a little girl, Consuelo would wander those rooms cautiously, for she understood early that everything was in its place by design, and that the unseen hand of her mother directed the arrangement of both furniture and lives. Her own chamber looked down onto that walled garden, On bright mornings, sunlight would creep across her embroidered coverlet, and she would hear the gardeners at their work below, pruning and clipping with the soft snip of shears. But the windows opened only so far, and the garden gate was locked unless her mother allowed an outing. In those years, she did not question such boundaries. She accepted that the world was ordered in this way, with pleasures granted in measured portions and freedoms always weighed against appearances. Alva Vanderbilt was not the kind of mother who filled a child's life with indulgent affection. She was a presence of precision, her will expressed in both the grandeur of her surroundings and the ambitions she nurtured for her daughter. Alva saw in Consuelo a beauty that could be more than ornament. It could be currency in a world where her own family's new money was still regarded with a hint of disdain by the older social order. She did not conceal her intentions. Even as a child, Consuelo would overhear talk of suitable alliances, of titles and fortunes that might be joined. The names of young men floated through the air like pieces in a game that was still many years from being played, but already the board had been set. And yet childhood has its small refuges. In the quietest corners of the house, far from her mother's notice, Consuelo would find spaces that belonged to her alone, the narrow landing between staircases where the light fell just so in the afternoons, the little library on the third floor where a tall window overlooked the rooftops and the sound of the city softened into a distant hum. There she would trace her fingers over the spines of books she could not yet fully understand, lingering on the gilt lettering as though it might reveal its meaning through touch. When visitors came, the mansion would transform. Chandeliers were lit even in the afternoon, and the air filled with the scent of polished wood and newly arranged flowers. Consuelo was dressed as part of the display, her hair brushed to a shining smoothness, her manner gentle yet precise. She learned to speak when addressed, to listen more than she spoke, to keep her back straight and her hands folded lightly in her lap. Guests would comment on her poise, and Alva would smile as though this was not a child but an accomplishment. But there were moments, fleeting, easily missed, when her eyes would turn toward the garden gate. It was not escape she thought of, for she had no notion of a life beyond what she knew. It was simply the idea of walking into a space where she was unobserved, of choosing her own path between the hedges, of plucking a rose without asking. She had once tried to open that gate herself, the cool iron resisting her small hands. When she was discovered, the key was taken further out of reach, and the incident was not mentioned again. The seasons turned within that cage. Winter brought a stillness to the garden. The roses pruned down to bare stems, the fountain at the center emptied and silent. Spring returned color and fragrance, but the rhythm was always the same: beauty under control, life within boundaries. In those years, Consuelo's understanding of the world was shaped by that rhythm. She would learn, as she grew, that these boundaries were not only her mother's making, but the very structure of the society into which she had been born. Occasionally, Alva would take her on carriage rides along Fifth Avenue, where the houses stood like fortresses and the women on the sidewalks moved as though aware of being seen. From behind the glass, Consuelo would watch the city pass by, the handsome cabs, the shop windows, the newsboys shouting headlines into the wind. She saw young girls walking with their mothers, their laughter unguarded, and she wondered if they too returned each evening to a life that was not entirely theirs. It was during one of these rides that she first saw St. Thomas Church, its spire rising against the winter sky. She did not know then that she would walk its aisle years later, the air heavy with roses, her hand guided by the weight of expectation. At that time, it was simply another building among many, and she turned her gaze back to the garden in her mind, the locked gate glinting faintly in the sun. In the evenings, after the lamps were lit and the long dinners concluded, Consuelo would sometimes slip away to her window. From there she could see the garden under moonlight, the shadows soft against the gravel paths. She imagined walking there alone, the gravel crunching beneath her slippers, the roses bending in the night air. It was a vision that soothed her, though it was always just beyond reach. One spring morning she awoke to find the garden transformed. Overnight, the roses had burst into full bloom, their petals heavy with dew. The fountain had been refilled, its water catching the early light in silver arcs. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, breathing in the faint trace of their scent even from above. Somewhere within her, the sight stirred both joy and a kind of yearning she could not name. Years later, when the scent of roses would again fill her senses on her wedding day, it would bring her back to this moment. The vision of beauty glimpsed through a barrier, the knowledge that some doors were meant to be opened only by another's hand. The garden had taught her this without words, that even the loveliest places can confine, and that the longing to step beyond them may never fade entirely. That morning, as the gardeners moved about their work and the household stirred to life, Consuelo turned away from the window. Somewhere below, the gate stood locked, its iron bars cool in the shade. The dew was already drying from the roses, their fragrance drifting upward in waves that would dissipate before reaching her. And as she stepped into the hallway, the scent followed her just long enough to make her pause, as though urging her to remember the feel of a place she had never truly walked. The locked garden gate stood in the morning shade, a quiet sentinel, its bars casting narrow shadows on the gravel path. Beyond it, the roses stirred faintly in the breeze, their leaves whispering a language too soft to decipher. Consuelo carried the memory of that gate with her as she walked through the mansion's corridors toward the great drawing room, the place where her mother's world was spun and stitched into the patterns that governed their lives. The sound of her slippers on the polished floor seemed small beneath the weight of the air there, an air steeped in polish, perfume, and the faint trace of cigar smoke from the night before. Alva Vanderbilt's drawing room was less a place of leisure than a command post. Its tall windows overlooked Fifth Avenue, where carriages passed in measured procession, each one a silent performance of status. Within, the walls were covered in silk, damask the color of old gold, reflecting the light of crystal chandeliers that glittered even in the morning. A great marble fireplace stood unlit, its mantel crowded with vases of flowers whose stems were trimmed to exact lengths. On this morning, Alva sat at a table scattered with cards, letters, and the cream-colored sheets of embossed stationery that carried the Vanderbilt name across the city and beyond. Her posture was exact, her pen moving swiftly across the paper, its nib scratching in a rhythm as steady as a clock. Every name she wrote was chosen with intent. Every invitation sent was a thread in the web she wove to secure her place among the highest circles of society. Consuelo entered quietly, but her mother did not glance up at once. She continued to write, dipping her pen in the inkwell, pausing only to blot the page before setting it aside. When at last she looked up, her gaze was clear, appraising, as though she were measuring her daughter against some invisible scale. "You will be fitted for the new gown this afternoon," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a statement of fact. "The Worth shipment arrived yesterday. We shall be receiving the Marquess and his family at the end of the month, and you will wear the blue silk." There was no room for dissent in her tone, nor was dissent something Consuelo had yet learned to voice. She nodded, aware that the Marquess was not merely a guest, but a potential link in a chain of alliances that extended across the ocean. It was in moments like these that she understood her role was not unlike that of the roses in the garden, nurtured, displayed, and presented to the right audience at the right time. Alva returned to her writing, her gloved fingers steady despite the ink stains at their tips. Around her, the room bore the marks of countless mornings like this one, the faint grooves in the table where a pen had pressed too hard, the small discoloration in the carpet where tea had once spilled but been carefully cleaned. These were the quiet evidences of a life devoted not to leisure, but to strategy. For Alva was not content with wealth alone. The Vanderbilt fortune was vast, yet to her it lacked the one thing that would place it beyond reproach, the patina of aristocratic connection. Consuelo stood by the window, looking out at the avenue below. She saw the line of carriages, the glint of wheels in the pale sun, the figures moving along the sidewalks in their winter coats. Somewhere among them could be a life she would never know, choices she would never be free to make. Behind her, the sound of the pen continued, each name etched onto the page like a step in a long procession toward a destination already chosen. Her mother spoke again, this time without looking up. "We are not of those who are content to drift. We are not invited. We invite. Remember that, Consuelo. It is the difference between being a guest and being the reason for the gathering." The words settled between them, as heavy and deliberate as the furnishings of the room. Consuelo thought of the locked garden gate and how it too decided who entered and who remained outside. There was a kind of power in such control, but it was a power she had never been allowed to hold herself. Later, as the morning waned, the drawing room filled with the low murmur of voices. Visitors arrived. Ladies in hats with veils that fell just to the cheekbone, men with gloves tucked neatly into their pockets. They spoke of dinners past and dances to come, of who had been seen with whom, of whose name had been left curiously absent from the latest guest list. Alva listened to all of it with a stillness that belied her alertness, filing away each detail for use at another time. Consuelo sat beside her, offering polite smiles, her words few but always measured. She was aware of the glances cast her way, assessments of her beauty, her posture, the cut of her gown. It was a silent market, and she its most valuable display. When one of the ladies mentioned a recent engagement between a wealthy American heiress and a titled Englishman, Alva's eyes met her daughter's for just a moment, a glance that spoke volumes without a sound. By afternoon, the guests had departed, leaving the air faintly scented with their perfumes. Alva gathered her letters into a neat stack, her expression unreadable. "The Marquess's family will expect refinement, not ostentation," she said, as though continuing a conversation that had begun days before. "You will charm without seeming to try. That is the art of it." Consuelo wondered if there was an art to being oneself, or if that, too, had to be constructed to suit the audience. She thought again of the roses in the garden, pruned into perfect shapes that pleased the eye, but bore little resemblance to how they might grow freely. In this house, and in her mother's world, beauty was never left to chance. As the day faded, the drawing room grew quieter. The light shifted, casting long shadows across the gold walls, and the scratch of the pen ceased. For a moment, there was only the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Consuelo lingered by the window again, watching as the lamps along Fifth Avenue flickered to life, their glow diffused in the early evening mist. Her mother's voice broke the stillness once more, softer this time, but no less certain. "Everything worth having must be earned, Consuelo, and once it is earned, it must be kept. Never forget that." She did not answer. She only looked out at the street where the passing carriages were reduced to silhouettes, their wheels whispering over the damp pavement. Somewhere out there was a world not written on her mother's stationery, a world with no guest lists and no locked gates. But here, in the empire Alva ruled from her drawing room, the script had been written long before Consuelo learned to read it. And as the lamps inside the house were lit one by one, the shadows in the garden outside deepened until the gate was no longer visible at all. The shadows in the garden thickened until the gate itself dissolved into the darkness. And in that dimness, the house seemed to draw inward, its great rooms folding into themselves for the night. Somewhere far above the street, in a quiet chamber where the sound of the avenue could not reach, The faintest rustle of paper disturbed the still air. It was the sound of a letter being drawn from its hiding place, the careful slide of an envelope across the smooth wood of a desk. Consuelo sat alone, the single lamp on her writing table casting a narrow pool of light that fell upon the folded pages before her. The day's polite conversations, the measured glances, the appointments decided without her consent. All of it receded as she looked at the familiar hand that had shaped each line of ink. These were not the precise strokes of her mother's correspondence, nor the bold signatures of men in politics and society. This was a hand she knew from walks in the early evening, from summers where the air had been warm enough to soften every shadow, from moments when the world felt unobserved. She traced the edges of the paper with her fingertips, as though touching it might bring him nearer. The ink, now dry for many days, held words she knew by memory, for she had read them again and again since their arrival. They spoke of longing, of promises whispered in a language of glances and silences, of a vision of life not drawn in the lines of duty, but in the curves of affection freely given. He wrote of places they might see together, green hills far from the city, small towns where no one knew the weight of their names. Yet the very fact that this letter lay hidden, folded away when the day began, told the rest of the story. Such dreams had no place in Alva Vanderbilt's empire. The man who had written it could offer her neither a title nor the social elevation her mother demanded. His wealth was modest, his influence limited, but he had offered something far rarer, himself without condition. It was an offer Consuelo had once believed she could accept until the reality of her mother's will had proven stronger than her own. The memory of their last meeting returned unbidden, the way he had taken her hand, not with the formality expected in drawing rooms, but with an urgency that felt like truth. She had felt the warmth of his fingers even as she heard her mother's voice in her mind, reminding her of her place, her duty, her future. She had said goodbye without using the word, leaving him to understand that some walls could not be climbed, no matter the depth of feeling on either side. Now the letter lay open on the desk, the words visible yet powerless to alter the course set for her. Beyond her closed door, the house settled into night, the distant sound of servants extinguishing lamps moving slowly through the halls. She could almost imagine that somewhere in the darkness he might be walking, thinking of her, though the miles between them made such thoughts little more than a comfort she allowed herself before sleep. She folded the letter once more, the creases aligning perfectly with those already there, and slid it back into its envelope. It would return to its place among the others she had kept, a small collection hidden away, each one a fragment of a life that could have been. She did not keep them as rebellion. She kept them because to throw them away would be to erase the one part of herself that was hers alone. Rising from the desk, she crossed to the window. The street below lay in darkness, except for the occasional glow of a carriage lamp, the sound of wheels muffled against the damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a bell struck the hour, its chime soft and measured. She rested her forehead against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of the city beneath her feet, the pulse of a place that moved on whether or not she chose to move with it. Behind her, the desk lamp burned steadily, the envelope resting beneath a sheet of blank paper as though it had never been touched. She knew that tomorrow the duties of her life would press in again. Fittings, luncheons, carefully arranged encounters with men whose names had been spoken over her head for years. And when she smiled at them, as she had been taught, none would know that a part of her remained elsewhere, walking those imagined hills, hearing laughter that belonged only to her. In the weeks to come, the letters would stop, whether by his choice or by the weight of silence between them. She would not know. What she did know was that the path before her had narrowed, leading not toward the green hills of her thoughts, but toward the cold stone of another country's estate. She had not yet seen it, but she had heard its name often enough. Blenheim. A palace in England, vast and storied, its history written in battles and victories far removed from her own life. She imagined it as she stood there, the image drawn from half-heard descriptions, its endless corridors, its gardens more formal and restrained than the one she had known, its windows reflecting a sky of gray more often than blue. In her mind, she tried to place herself there, walking those halls with her hand resting lightly on the arm of the man who would be her husband. The picture felt as distant as a scene from another century, yet she knew it would soon be her reality. The lamp flickered faintly, its light catching on the polished edge of the desk. She thought of how easily paper burns, how quickly words can be turned to ash, and yet how stubbornly memory resists such destruction. The letters would remain hidden for now, their presence as much a secret to herself as to anyone else. And when the time came to pack for the crossing to England, she would have to decide whether to carry them with her across the sea or leave them behind, locked away in a house that would no longer be hers. For now, she slipped the envelope deeper into its place, extinguished the lamp, and let the room fall into shadow. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, as though the night itself were trying to wash the air clean. She lay down, the darkness pressing close, and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the shifting edge between waking and sleep, she thought she heard the rustle of paper again, though her hands were empty, and the sound faded into the rhythm of the rain against the glass. By morning, the rain would clear, and the day would bring with it the map of a journey she had not chosen, its lines leading east across the ocean. But for this last hour of the night, she held to the image of the hills he had described, the light falling gently on the grass, the air untroubled by duty. It was an image without walls, without gates, and it was hers, if only in the quiet recess of her mind. The unopened letter, returned to its quiet place in the desk, became in time a folded map lying on a polished table, its creases worn from being opened and smoothed again by hands not her own. The map was marked in faint pencil with a thin line that began at the eastern edge of the American coast, crossed the pale blue expanse of the Atlantic, and ended on the gray shores of England. The voyage had been spoken of for weeks in tones that suggested inevitability rather than excitement. To Consuelo, it felt less like travel and more like a measured crossing from one existence into another, the sort of passage that has no return. The morning of departure was cold and clear, the kind of air that makes breath visible but carries no scent of spring. At the dock, the great ship loomed like a floating city, its black hull rising from the water with an air of certainty, as though it had been built to withstand not only storms, but the hesitations of those it carried. The gangway clanged faintly underfoot as trunks were loaded and steamer cases stacked, each one marked with her initials in neat gold lettering. As she stepped aboard, the sound of the city began to fade, replaced by the creak of rope and the low thrum of engines waking. The ship's deck smelled faintly of oil and salt, the rails cold beneath her gloved hands. She stood there as the lines were drawn in, watching the pier recede, the figures on it shrinking until they were no more than dark shapes against the pale outline of the shore. Somewhere among them her mother stood, though Consuelo did not raise her hand to wave. The water was steel gray beneath the winter sky, the waves slow and heavy as the ship turned toward the open sea. A gull followed briefly, its wings flashing white against the darker clouds, before it wheeled away toward the harbor. The air here was different, sharper, cleaner, carrying with it a faint metallic tang from the ocean itself. Each breath seemed to strip away a layer of the city, though what it revealed beneath was not freedom but the vast unknown. Her cabin was richly appointed, with polished wood paneling and a narrow bed tucked against the wall. A single porthole looked out onto the restless water, its surface shifting from slate to silver as the light changed. She spent the first hours there unpacking small things, a book bound in green leather, a silver brush, a shawl with the faint scent of lavender. The larger trunks remained unopened, their contents to be revealed only upon arrival. It was as though even her belongings understood that this was not a place to settle, only to pass through. The days found their rhythm quickly. Morning walks on the deck, where the wind pulled at her veil and the salt stung her cheeks. Afternoons in the ship's lounge, where passengers gathered to speak in polite murmurs over tea. Evenings in the dining room, the clink of silver against china accompanied by the low hum of conversation in more than one language. Among the passengers were others making similar crossings, Americans bound for European tours, Englishmen returning from business, women whose jewels caught the lamplight as they lifted their glasses. Consuelo moved among them with the practiced grace that had been shaped in her mother's drawing room. Yet here it felt oddly detached, as though she were watching herself from a small distance. She smiled when addressed, answered when spoken to, and yet her thoughts were often far from the table. At times, as she stood at the rail in the late afternoon, she could almost believe the water stretched endlessly, that the ship might go on forever without touching land. One evening, the sky cleared entirely, revealing stars so numerous and bright they seemed to spill across the blackness without end. She stood alone on the upper deck, the sound of the engines a deep, steady pulse beneath her feet. Somewhere behind her, music drifted faintly from the lounge, the notes carried away almost immediately by the wind. She thought of the letter hidden in her desk back in New York, of the words that had spoken of hills and towns, and a life that now belonged only to imagination. Out here, between continents, there was no garden gate, no locked door, only the expanse of water, indifferent and infinite. Yet with each day, the line on the map drew closer to its end. She began to hear passengers speak of England, of the weather in London, of invitations waiting for them upon arrival. The Duke's name was spoken more often now, in tones of polite curiosity or admiration, depending on the company. Consuelo listened without comment, her gaze often fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the sea in a line so faint it seemed drawn in water rather than ink. On the seventh morning, the sea grew rougher. The sky was a low, unbroken gray, and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. Waves struck the hull with a steady rhythm, sending a faint shudder through the deck. She walked there anyway, holding to the rail as the ship tilted gently beneath her. The cold was sharper now, the air heavier, as though they were drawing nearer to land even before it was visible. When at last the coast appeared, it did so without fanfare, a faint shadow against the pale horizon, growing slowly into a darker line. The air seemed to change again, carrying with it a scent she could not name, something of damp earth and stone and the faint smoke of distant chimneys. As the day wore on, the outline sharpened, cliffs pale against the water, fields stretching beyond, dotted with hedgerows. By the time the ship entered the harbor, the sky had begun to clear. Small boats moved among the waves, their sails catching the late afternoon light. On the quay, figures gathered, their coats drawn tight against the wind. Somewhere among them, she knew, would be those sent to receive her, to take her to the place she had heard of so often but never seen. That evening, as the trunks were lifted once more and the gangway lowered, she paused at the rail for a moment longer. The journey across had been a passage not only of miles, but of time. The days at sea blurring together into something that already felt distant. She looked back once toward the open water, its surface catching the last light before the sky deepened into night. Then she turned toward the shore, where the road to Blenheim awaited, winding unseen beyond the harbor's edge. And far in the distance, shrouded in the soft haze of winter mist, lay the silhouette of a house so vast it seemed less a dwelling than a monument, a place where her life, as it had been, would end, and where another, still unknowable, would begin. The winter mist that had blurred the harbor followed her inland, settling in the folds of the countryside as the carriage carried her toward the place she had heard named so often it had begun to feel less like a destination than a legend. The road wound through bare fields where frost lay in the furrows, and low stone walls ran like faded stitches across the land. Now and then, the silhouettes of trees rose against the pale sky, their branches black and still, their roots sunk deep in ground that had known centuries of cold seasons. It was late afternoon when the first high gates appeared, their wrought iron black against the pale fog. The creak of their opening echoed faintly in the quiet, a sound that seemed to acknowledge her arrival and to warn her at once. Beyond them stretched a long avenue lined with ancient oaks, their trunks thick and weathered, their limbs meeting overhead to form a kind of solemn canopy. The horses moved steadily, their breath steaming in the cold, the wheels crunching over gravel that had been laid long before her birth. And then the house came into view, or rather, the palace. Blenheim rose from the mist in a sweep of stone so vast that it seemed to belong to another order of time entirely. Its facade stretched outward in both directions, lined with windows that caught what little light remained and returned it in muted glints. Towers and chimneys broke the skyline, while at its center, a great portico stood like the entry to a temple. She could not yet take in all of it, for her eyes kept returning to the sheer scale, the way the building seemed to absorb the landscape around it. The carriage passed under the arch and into the forecourt, where the sound of hooves rang sharper against the stone. Footmen in livery waited, their breath forming pale clouds in the air, their faces composed into the same practiced stillness she had seen in the servants of her childhood home. But here, even the silence felt older, heavier, as though it carried the weight of every arrival before hers. Inside, the air was cooler than she expected, with a faint scent of stone and wood polish. The great hall opened above her in a soaring expanse, its ceiling painted with scenes of battles and victories, the figures frozen mid-motion as though awaiting some unheard signal to move again. Portraits lined the walls, their frames massive and dark, their subjects watching her with the steady gaze of those who had never needed to justify their place in the world. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floor as she was led through a series of corridors. The Duke walked beside her, his manner courteous but restrained, speaking occasionally to point out a piece of family history, a tapestry commissioned by an ancestor, a room where a monarch had once stayed. His voice did not rise or fall much, and she could not tell whether he recited these things from pride or simply from habit. The corridors were long and cool, the light from tall windows falling in narrow strips across the stone. In some rooms, the air held the faint sweetness of beeswax from recently polished furniture. In others, there was only the dry scent of age. They passed through a library whose shelves climbed nearly to the ceiling, the leather spines darkened with time. In the great salon, mirrors reflected the light of a chandelier into countless fragments, making the space shimmer faintly even in the dimness of the afternoon. Her own rooms lay in a wing that looked out over the gardens. From the windows, she could see the clipped hedges, the ornamental ponds, the gravel walks laid out in precise lines. Even now, in the muted colors of winter, their symmetry was striking. Beyond them, the parkland stretched into a faint haze, dotted with trees that stood solitary against the pale grass. Somewhere out there, unseen in the mist, was the great lake she had heard of, its surface now likely hard with frost. As evening settled, she found herself alone in the room prepared for her. The fire burned low in the grate, its light flickering over the carved bedstead and the heavy draperies. On a table near the window stood a single candle, its flame bending slightly in the draught from the casement. She moved toward it, her fingers brushing the cool glass of the pane, and looked out at the gardens again. The shapes were softer now, almost formless in the gathering dark, but the long, straight paths still caught the last of the light, leading the eye toward the horizon. The stillness here was different from that of her mother's house. In New York, silence had been an active thing, maintained and controlled, a product of order. Here, it was older, something that seemed to have settled into the stone itself. She could almost believe that if she listened closely enough, she might hear the faint tread of footsteps from centuries past, or the low murmur of voices in rooms no longer used. Later, after the house had gone quiet, she wandered a little, her slippers soundless on the thick carpets. She passed through a narrow corridor where the portraits were smaller, the faces less formal, perhaps family members whose names had slipped from the main line of history. In one, a young woman stood beside a window, her gaze turned towards something unseen beyond it. There was no nameplate, only a small crest in the corner of the frame. Consuelo paused before it, wondering if the woman had felt as she did now, present in the house yet not yet part of it. The candle in her own room burned lower, its light pooling across the polished table. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, the sound traveling through the corridors with a soft, metallic resonance. She thought of how many such hours the house had measured, how many lives had been lived within its walls, and how easily her own might be absorbed into that unbroken span. Standing there, she felt the faint draft again, and the candle flame bent once more. The light cast long, flickering shadows across the wall, and for a moment it seemed as though the painted figures in the portraits leaned closer, as if to study the newest arrival among them. The candle flame quivered in the draught, and as the night surrendered to dawn, its glow thinned into the pale wash of morning light. That same light now fell across the writing desk in her chambers, tracing a long, cool rectangle over the inkwell, the neatly stacked stationery, and the small vase into which someone had placed 3 sprigs of winter greenery. The fire had burned low, leaving a faint scent of ash that mingled with the sharper smell of fresh ink. She sat at the desk in her dressing gown, the fabric heavy enough to guard against the morning chill. Outside, the gardens lay still, frost catching on the clipped hedges so that each leaf seemed edged with silver. The gravel paths glistened faintly where dew had frozen in the night. Somewhere below, a gardener's spade scraped softly against the earth, though the ground was too hard for planting. On the desk before her lay a list in another hand, written in the Duke's secretary's measured script. The day's obligations were set out in precise lines: a visit to the village school, an appearance at the hospital, the final arrangements for a charity luncheon to be held in Oxford the following week. There was a dinner in the evening with a member of Parliament and his wife, and notes on which topics were to be discussed and which avoided. The list was not oppressive in length, yet its formality gave it weight, as though each entry were a small stone to be carried. She picked up the pen and began her correspondence. There were thank you notes to be written for gifts received, letters of support to charitable committees, short acknowledgments to acquaintances who had sent invitations she could not accept. Her handwriting, always neat, seemed even more deliberate here, each curve and line reflecting the composure she was expected to embody. She wondered as she dipped the pen again whether anyone receiving these letters would imagine the face of the woman who wrote them, or if her words were merely another piece in the machinery of a household that had been functioning long before her arrival. By late morning, the first of the duties began. She descended the main staircase, its balustrade cool beneath her gloved hand, and stepped into the great hall where the Duke waited. He was already dressed for the day, his expression courteous but distant, as though they met in the course of mutual work rather than personal companionship. Together they entered the carriage, the sound of the horses' hooves carrying them down the long drive toward the village. At the school, children stood as they entered, their cheeks pink from the cold, their eyes darting between her and the Duke. She spoke with the headmistress, asked polite questions about lessons and attendance, and listened as the children recited their work. There was genuine warmth in their voices, and for a moment she felt a kind of ease in their company, a reminder that not all human encounters were governed by strategy. Still, when they left, she carried with her not the sound of their laughter, but the image of their small hands, red from the cold, folded neatly on their desks as they had been taught. The hospital was quieter, its corridors lined with the scent of carbolic and the muted tread of nurses moving between wards. She stopped at each bed, offering a few words, her voice low so as not to disturb others. In one ward, an elderly woman reached for her hand, her fingers light but insistent. For a moment, Consuelo stood there, feeling the faint pulse beneath the skin, until the nurse moved forward to adjust the blanket, and the moment passed. By afternoon, they returned to Blenheim. The pale light had grown thin, and the sky hung low over the parkland. She took tea in the smaller drawing room, where the fire was bright and the chairs placed close enough to catch its warmth. A secretary brought in more papers for her to review, proposals for the luncheon seating arrangements, menus written in a careful hand. She considered them, making small adjustments, knowing that these choices, though minor, would be noticed by those who attended. The evening's dinner required a change into a gown of deep green silk, chosen for its richness in the candlelight. In the dining hall, the long table glittered with crystal and silver, the flames from the tall tapers reflected in the polished surfaces. Conversation moved along its measured course, the Member of Parliament speaking at length on trade matters, his wife inquiring after the progress of the gardens. Consuelo responded as she had been taught, listening more than she spoke, offering comments that revealed interest without overstepping. Between courses, she glanced toward the tall windows. Beyond them, the night pressed close, its darkness unbroken by moon or stars. The sound of the wind rose faintly against the glass, as if reminding her of the world outside these formal rooms. But when the next dish was served, she turned back to her companions, her expression as composed as the portraits that lined the walls. The dinner ended with coffee in the library, the guests lingering to admire a newly restored painting. The Duke stood beside her, their proximity formal, their words to one another few. When at last the guests departed, their carriages rolling away into the night, she returned to her rooms. The fire there had been rekindled, the flames casting a softer light than the chandeliers below. On her desk, the list of duties for the following day had already been placed, the ink still fresh. She sat for a while without touching it, her gaze drifting toward the frost-bright gardens beyond the window. The day had been full, yet she could not say whether it had truly been lived or simply carried out. From somewhere deep in the house came an unexpected sound, a cry, sharp and sudden, breaking the measured stillness. It was not human, but the high, echoing call of a peacock in the gardens, its voice carrying through the cold night air. She rose and went to the window, straining to see its shape in the darkness. The sound came again, distant yet distinct, before fading into the quiet once more. She stood there for a long moment, the frost misting the glass beneath her breath, listening to the silence that followed. In its wake, the duties of the day seemed both small and immense, threads woven into a tapestry whose full pattern she had yet to see. The peacock's cry faded into the cold night, leaving behind a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb even the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. That silence, thin yet unyielding, carried itself into the following mornings, into the corridors and drawing rooms, into the long meals where words were measured and pauses stretched like unspooled thread. It was not the silence of peace, but the kind that lies between two people who know each other's presence, yet cannot find the path back to the same place. In the weeks that followed her arrival at Blenheim, Consuelo began to notice the spaces between her and the Duke as if they were physical rooms. He was unfailingly courteous, unfailingly correct, his voice never sharp, his gestures never careless. But there was a reserve in him that neither warmth nor anger seemed able to reach. At breakfast, they spoke of the day's appointments, of the weather's influence on the gardens, of letters received from mutual acquaintances. By the time the silver covers were lifted from the last dish, their words had already dwindled, leaving the quiet to rise between them again. In the great dining hall, with its high ceiling painted in muted tones of gold and ochre, the sound of their cutlery on porcelain was amplified by the vastness around them. The long table, set with perfect precision, seemed a physical emblem of the distance they maintained, each seated at a place appointed by tradition, the intervening space occupied only by polished silver, crystal glasses, and the faint scent of the dishes being served. Servants moved silently in and out, their faces politely impassive, their presence a reminder that even this private space was never truly private. The corridors, too, held their own quiet. In the afternoons, she might pass him as he returned from his study, a sheaf of papers in his hand. They would exchange a nod, perhaps a brief comment about the evening's arrangements, and then move past each other, their footsteps fading in opposite directions. Once or twice she caught the look of thought still in his eyes, a look turned inward, as though his mind had long since shifted to matters where she did not belong. It was not that they disagreed on anything specific. Rather, it was as though their lives ran on parallel tracks, close enough to be aware of each other but never touching. Even when they hosted gatherings, when they stood together to greet guests at the great entrance, she could feel the line between them, invisible but present. He would turn to her with a small, correct smile, and she would return it, both of them playing their roles with the kind of skill that comes from long observation of others doing the same. In the evenings, after the guests had gone and the fires burned low, she would retreat to her rooms while he returned to his study. From the window, she could sometimes see the glow of a lamp in that distant part of the house, a small square of light against the stone. It would remain there until late, long after she had set aside her book or her writing. She never asked what occupied him, and he never volunteered the answer. Yet for all the coolness between them, the life of the house went on. There were dinners to attend, charitable visits to make, estates to oversee. The machinery of Blenheim turned with a smoothness that left little room for disruption. And perhaps it was that very smoothness that concealed the hairline fractures beneath, small, quiet things that widened with time, invisible until the day they could no longer be ignored. Once, while passing through the long gallery, she paused before a portrait she had not noticed before. It was of a couple. The woman's gaze turned toward the man's eyes fixed elsewhere. The brushwork was soft, but the distance between them was unmistakable. She wondered whether the painter had seen it in life or had added it from imagination. In either case, the image held her for a long moment before she moved on. On another afternoon, she found herself alone in the smaller library. The fire there had been newly lit, and the scent of burning wood mingled with the faint must of old leather bindings. She selected a book at random, only to find a note in the margin written in a hand she did not recognize. The words were brief, a quotation about truth and compromise underlined twice. She traced the lines lightly with her finger, feeling as though she had stumbled upon a whisper left behind by someone who had once stood where she did now, considering the weight of choices made. When they dined together without guests, the atmosphere was more muted still. She might speak of a letter from her mother, of some request for a visit or a report on happenings in New York. He would listen politely, then answer with news of estate matters, a tenant's complaint, a repair to be made on the far side of the park. Between such exchanges lay stretches of quiet that neither seemed inclined to bridge. At times, she caught herself imagining a different version of this life, one where the walls between them were not so high, where the rooms of the palace were filled with easy conversation instead of polite formality. But such thoughts dissolved quickly, swept aside by the knowledge that this was not the role she had been brought here to play. The Duchess of Marlborough was expected to be gracious, poised, and untroubled. Anything less would ripple outward through the circles they inhabited. Late one night, she walked the long corridor outside her rooms, the thick carpets soft beneath her steps. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of beeswax from the day's polishing. She passed closed doors, their brass handles catching the dim light from the wall sconces. At the far end, she paused, hearing the faintest creak as another door closed quietly, somewhere beyond sight. The sound was so slight that it might have been the house settling in the night, yet it carried with it a curious sense of secrecy. Returning to her room, she stood by the window once more, looking out over the gardens. The frost was heavy on the gravel paths, glittering faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere below, perhaps near the ornamental pond, a shadow moved, too far to identify, gone before she could lean closer to see. The night was still again, but the image remained in her mind as she prepared for bed. The next morning she would walk the same paths in daylight, the frost gone, the garden seemingly untouched. But that faint creak of the door, that glimpse of a moving shadow, would stay with her. A reminder that even in the most ordered of houses, there are spaces where things go unseen. The faint creak of the unseen door lingered in her mind as the following evening settled over the house. A winter dusk that came early and seemed to draw every corridor into shadow. Blenheim's vast rooms glowed in pools of lamplight, each circle of brightness, leaving the edges in soft darkness, as if secrecy itself had taken form there. It was in such half-lit hours that voices lowered, that conversation slipped into quieter registers, and that the fabric of polite society was embroidered with threads unseen by those who were not meant to notice. She found herself in the smaller drawing room that evening, a place more intimate than the great salons, though still rich with the trappings of heritage. Gilded frames, porcelain figurines on marble-top tables, a carpet whose colors had faded into a harmony of deep reds and muted golds. The fire burned low, its light catching on the polished brass fender, and the air held the mingled scents of beeswax, lavender, and the faint tang of wood smoke from the chimneys. The Duke was not there. In his place, a cluster of guests had gathered, some seated, others standing with glasses in hand. They spoke in the measured tones of those who know that walls have ears. A lady in a gown the color of moss leaned slightly toward her companion, her fan half raised as she murmured something that brought a shadow of a smile to his lips. Across the room, two gentlemen stood apart, their conversation so low it might have been mistaken for the hum of the fire. Consuelo moved among them with the ease she had been trained to show, pausing here to listen, there to answer a question with the appropriate degree of warmth. Yet beneath the surface of each exchange, she sensed currents running deeper than the words themselves, alliances formed not with formal agreements, but with glances, pauses, the subtle emphasis of a name spoken at just the right moment. At one point, she found herself beside a table where a silver tray held the remains of coffee cups and a small dish of sugared almonds. A gentleman, tall and slightly stooped, stepped near, his voice low as he commented on the recent presence of a certain politician at the estate. "One never knows whether he comes for the pleasure of the conversation or the advantage of it," he said, the corner of his mouth tightening as if he knew the answer and chose not to speak it aloud. She replied with a polite remark, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, and he inclined his head in approval at her discretion. The room seemed to breathe with the rhythm of such exchanges. Laughter rose softly from one corner, quickly tempered into a more formal tone as another guest approached. A mention of a name would drift across the air and then vanish, replaced by another, as though the topics themselves were being escorted in and out like guests at a gathering too private for the broader company. From her place near the mantel, Consuelo could see the reflection of the room in the tall pier glass opposite. In it, the gestures and expressions seemed slightly removed, as if she were watching a play performed behind a veil. It occurred to her that much of life here was like that, an endless series of performances, each role tailored to the audience at hand. Now and again she caught fragments that hinted at more than they revealed. A remark about a new appointment in Parliament, spoken with the barest trace of irony, a question about the health of an absent figure, followed by a pause that seemed to hold more than concern. The language was never direct, the meaning never fully given. This was a world where truth was shaped to fit the room it occupied, and where the line between concealment and civility was often too fine to see. Later in the evening, as the gathering thinned, she found herself seated near the fire beside a woman whose eyes held a brightness that came not from the lamplight, but from an inner alertness. They spoke of trivial things at first, the weather's effect on the gardens, a recent charity event in London, but then the woman's voice dipped slightly. "One learns to listen," she said, her gaze steady on the flames, not to the words themselves, but to what is absent from them. Consuelo understood. She thought of the silences at her own table, of the way certain subjects seemed to dissolve before they could take shape. She wondered if this was the common thread between the households of rank and power, that what was unsaid often held more weight than what was spoken. By the time the last guests departed, the fire had burned down to a bed of embers, the brass fender warm to the touch. The servants moved quietly to collect the glasses and plates, their presence as unobtrusive as the shifting shadows. Consuelo lingered a moment longer, her gaze on the darkened doorway through which the voices had passed into the hall. As she rose, she noticed a faint scent lingering in the air. Cigar smoke, though no one in the room had been smoking when she entered. It clung faintly to the upholstery near the window, as if someone had stood there earlier in the evening, half concealed by the curtains, listening. She stepped closer, pulling the fabric slightly aside. The night beyond was black, the glass cool under her fingertips. In the reflection, her own face appeared alongside the dim outline of the room, the empty chairs, the dying fire. She let the curtain fall back into place, the fabric whispering against itself, and turned toward the corridor. The scent of smoke followed her out, faint but insistent, as though it did not wish to be forgotten. Somewhere in the quiet of the house, the whispers of the evening still seemed to hover, their meaning incomplete, waiting for the moment when absence would reveal more than presence ever could. The faint scent of cigar smoke lingered as she walked the dim corridor, but by morning it had thinned and dissolved into the cool air, replaced by the damp sweetness of leaves beginning to fall in the palace gardens. Autumn had arrived without flourish, as though it had been waiting in the shadows all along, ready to drape the grounds in muted colors and blur the crisp edges of summer with its softer lines. From her window, Consuelo watched the fog rise early, curling low over the gravel paths and hovering above the ornamental ponds so that the hedges seemed to float in a pale sea. The sound of the fountains was muffled, their regular fall of water barely reaching her ears, as though the garden itself had drawn inward to listen. It was in this season that she began, quietly and without ceremony, to find spaces that were hers alone. They were not locked or forbidden, no gate stood against her as in her childhood, but they were unclaimed, unnoticed by the patterns of formal life. A narrow bench beneath a copper beech whose leaves had turned to a deep, rich red, a path along the outer wall where moss grew thick and soft underfoot, a small alcove in the library where a window caught the last light of the afternoon. She did not declare them hers, but they became so by the simple act of returning. Her days still followed the expected rhythm, the scheduled visits, the dinners, the appearances that kept the machinery of the household turning. But within that structure, she began to allow herself small diversions. A book taken not for the prestige of its author, but for the shape of its sentences. A conversation with a gardener about the best time to move a rose bush. An hour spent sketching the twisted branches of a tree she could see from her room. These moments were unremarkable to anyone else, yet they felt to her like breaths drawn more deeply than usual, as though the air itself had grown easier to take in. In the gardens, the fog often thickened toward late afternoon, swallowing the distance so that the great facade of Blenheim appeared only in fragments, here a wing, there a tower, each emerging briefly before being veiled again. She would walk along the straight lines of the paths until they curved toward the lake, where the water's surface was often invisible beneath a pale skin of mist. The air there was colder, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves letting go from their branches. It was during one such walk that she noticed a small figure in the distance, moving slowly along the far edge of the grounds. As she drew nearer, she saw it was a young boy from the village, carrying a basket of apples. He stopped and removed his cap as she passed, his eyes quick but shy. They exchanged a few words, simple, about the weather, about his errand, and then he continued on, disappearing behind a hedge. It was a brief encounter, yet it lingered with her through the evening. In that moment, the boundaries between her life and the life of the village seemed thinner, the distance less certain. When she returned to the house, the air inside felt heavier, as though it had been closed against the fog for too long. The Duke was away for the evening, attending a meeting in Oxford, and the absence of the formal dinner allowed her to eat in the smaller dining room. The table there was modest in scale, the fire close enough to warm her without the need for additional light beyond the candles. She read as she ate, the sound of the turning pages a companionable rhythm. Later, in the library, she found herself alone. The great fireplace had been lit, the flames casting their light over the spines of books that rose high into the shadows above. She wandered among them without purpose, pulling one down at random. Inside, a pressed leaf lay between two pages, its shape delicate but intact. She turned it over in her hand, wondering who had placed it there and why. There was no inscription, no note, only the quiet presence of something once living, now preserved. She replaced it carefully and closed the book, returning it to its place. That night she opened her window before bed. The fog still lay heavy on the grounds, softening the outlines of the nearest trees. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a carriage drifted toward her, muffled by the damp air. She could not see it, but she imagined its wheels turning slowly along the gravel, the horse's breath steaming in the dark. She thought of the road that led away from Blenheim, through the village and into the fields beyond, and further still toward places she did not yet know. In the weeks that followed, these quiet moments accumulated, not as rebellion, but as a kind of private balance against the weight of her public role. She found herself looking forward to them in the same way one looks forward to the warmth of a fire in winter, not for the novelty, but for the steadying comfort they provided. And though she did not speak of them, she sensed that they were shaping her, drawing her inward in some ways and outward in others, toward a self not entirely defined by the walls around her. One afternoon, as she sat on the bench beneath the copper beech, a train whistle sounded in the far distance. It was a thin, almost plaintive note, yet it seemed to carry across the fields with unexpected clarity. She could not see the train itself, but she pictured it moving steadily through the countryside, its windows catching the low sun, its carriages carrying strangers toward destinations unknown. When the sound faded, she remained there a while longer, watching the fog drift and part among the trees. The path back to the house lay clear before her, but for the moment she did not take it. There was no urgency, only the quiet pull of the day's end, the faint promise of the fire that would be lit in her room, and the knowledge that tomorrow the train would pass again, whether or not she was there to hear it. As the light thinned, she rose at last and began the walk back toward the great stone facade. In the growing dimness, the windows of Blenheim glowed faintly, their reflections shivering in the ornamental ponds. Somewhere within, the evening would begin again. the lamplight, the measured voices, the duties that kept the house turning. Yet as she crossed the gravel, she still carried the sound of the whistle with her, a reminder that beyond the gates, the world moved on in its own rhythm, untouched by the order within. The sound of the train's whistle faded into the night air, its final note lingering just long enough to seem like a question left unanswered. In the weeks that followed, other sounds began to take its place, distant, irregular, and heavier, as if the earth itself were learning a new and uneasy rhythm. The newspapers had been speaking of tensions across the continent for months, but now the reports came faster, their language sharper. It was no longer the talk of diplomats and newspapers alone. It was the steady march of events drawing the world into a conflict that seemed, at first, too vast to touch the daily life within Blenheim's walls. Yet war, once begun, does not stay at the horizon. It seeps inward like damp into stone, at first unnoticed, then impossible to ignore. The first signs were small. The absence of familiar faces among guests, letters bearing news of postponements and cancellations, the murmur of conversations that stopped abruptly when a servant entered the room. The Duke spoke of committees and councils, of duties owed to country as well as estate. The language of society shifted. Where once the talk had been of garden parties and political alliances, now it was of regiments, supply lines, and casualty lists printed in black columns that no one wished to read, yet everyone did. Consuelo found herself drawn into a new set of duties, ones that reached beyond the ceremonial. The great halls of Blenheim, so often the scene of formal receptions, were opened for fundraising events. Their tables laid not with the elaborate spreads of past seasons, but with simple displays meant to encourage donations for the war effort. Rooms once kept closed were repurposed to store blankets, clothing, and parcels prepared for shipment. She began visiting the nearby hospital more often, the familiar corridors now crowded with new beds, hastily arranged in any space that could hold them. The air was sharp with the mingled scents of antiseptic and damp wool. The soldiers she met were sometimes no older than the village boys she had once seen carrying baskets to market, their faces pale under the weight of pain or exhaustion. She moved from bed to bed, offering small comforts, a word, a smile, the touch of a hand, aware that her presence was as much a reminder of the life they had left behind as it was a gesture of care. The gardens, too, began to change. Parts of the grounds were turned over to grow vegetables for the village and for the kitchens that now prepared food in greater quantities. The ornamental symmetry gave way in places to neat rows of beans, cabbages, and carrots, their growth as much a part of the war effort as any factory production. She would walk among them in the early morning, the frost melting on the leaves, feeling the quiet persistence of life even in the shadow of conflict. The nights were darker now. The great windows were covered or dimmed, their light concealed from above. Carriages moved less often along the drive, their absence leaving the evenings to a deeper kind of silence. Only the clocks continued their measured work, marking time that seemed both urgent and suspended. Letters from New York spoke of similar changes, though at a different pace, the ocean still offering some delay to the war's immediacy. Her mother's handwriting remained as precise as ever, though the content shifted from social maneuverings to relief committees and the movements of ships. Consuelo read them at her desk in the dim morning light, the ink sometimes smudged from a hurried hand or a damp crossing. One afternoon, while sorting through donations in one of the smaller rooms, she came across a parcel marked with a name she recognized. Inside were scarves, carefully knitted, the stitches tight and even. A note accompanied them, written in a looping hand, "For any who need warmth more than I do." She held it for a moment, the words simple yet carrying more weight than their few lines could hold. By late autumn, the war's presence had grown undeniable. The train that once passed beyond the gardens now carried soldiers in uniform, its whistle sounding not as a distant curiosity, but as a part of the daily rhythm, announcing departures and returns, though the latter were fewer. She would sometimes hear it in the night, the low rumble of its approach vibrating faintly through the stillness of her room. In the great hall, the portraits of ancestors seemed to look on with a new kind of gravity. Battles painted in sweeping strokes, once admired for their artistry, now carried the shadow of those unfolding beyond the reach of the artist's hand. She would stand before them, noting the calm certainty in the eyes of those who had fought in earlier centuries, and wonder what they would make of this war, where the front lines stretched not in neat formations, but in trenches filled with mud and shadow. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the gardens in a clean, unbroken sheet, muffling the sounds from beyond the estate. The lake froze at its edges, and the branches of the copper beech bent under the weight of frost. Within the house, fires burned longer, their warmth drawing people into closer company. Yet the conversations remained cautious, as though to speak too freely of the war would invite it more fully into the room. One evening, as she stood by the library window, she heard the faint rhythm of boots on the gravel outside. Looking out, she saw a small group of soldiers moving toward the servants' entrance, their breath rising in pale clouds. They walked slowly, as if carrying an invisible burden, their heads bent against the cold. She did not know their names, but she felt the pull of their presence, proof that the world beyond the gates was not another world at all, but the same one, moving closer every day. She remained at the window until they disappeared from view, the sound of their boots fading into the soft hush of falling snow. In the silence that followed, she could still sense the echo of their steps, as though the house itself had absorbed it into its memory, adding it to the long history written in its walls. The echo of the soldiers' boots lingered in the air long after the snow had covered their tracks, but in the weeks and months that followed, another, quieter sound began to take its place. A different kind of march, one measured not by the rhythm of feet, but by the slow turning of paper, the deliberate movement of pens across heavy parchment. It was the sound of legal words being committed to the page, of a union being undone, not with a sudden break, but with the gradual, formal severing that came from mutual understanding and necessity. The war continued to press upon daily life, yet between the charitable duties, the quiet evenings, and the formal meals, a second campaign was unfolding in rooms not open to visitors. It was a campaign without uniforms or banners, conducted in the language of solicitors and agreements, the kind that reduced years of life to clauses and signatures. Consuelo would sit at her desk, the papers before her a pale landscape of names, dates, and obligations, each one requiring her hand. The ink dried quickly in the winter air, but the meaning behind it seemed to sink into the room slowly, like a scent that lingers long after the source is gone. It was not anger that guided these proceedings, nor even the sharp sting of betrayal. Rather, it was the recognition that the life they had built, or been placed into, had never truly been shared. The distance between her and the Duke had been measured not in arguments, but in the absence of them, in the polite spaces carefully maintained so as not to disturb the balance of a structure they both inhabited but neither entirely claimed. Now, as the final arrangements were drawn, there was a kind of symmetry to the process, each step reflecting the careful formality with which they had lived. When they met to discuss the details, the conversations were brief, their tone courteous. The Duke would refer to practical matters, property, finances, arrangements for appearances still to be made together before the separation became known. She would listen, answer as needed, and leave with the sense that they were dismantling a house of cards neither of them had built, but both had been charged with maintaining. There were no raised voices, no accusations, only the soft closing of doors as they left each meeting, each returning to their own wing of the house. The staff, though discreet, could not entirely mask their awareness. Servants moved with the same precision as always, but there was a subtle change in their glances, a quiet acknowledgement of the shift taking place. The great rooms of Blenheim seemed to echo more sharply, as though the walls themselves sensed the change. Even the gardens took on a different air. The long paths, once a place for careful public walks, now became routes of solitary thought. One morning, after signing another set of documents, Consuelo stood by her window and looked out over the frost-covered grounds. The copper beech stood bare, its branches dark against the pale sky. A thin layer of ice had formed over the ornamental ponds, and the lawns bore the faint trace of deer tracks, crossing in the night. The scene was beautiful in its stillness, yet it held a kind of emptiness that mirrored the space opening within her life. In the afternoons, she sometimes took the carriage into the village alone. The visits to the school or the hospital continued, but now there was no expectation of returning in time for a shared dinner. She would linger a little longer among the shelves of the small bookshop or pause to speak with the woman who kept the post office, their conversation unhurried in the way that only those outside the demands of formal life could afford. These small exchanges, simple and genuine, felt more substantial than many of the formal gatherings she had attended in the past years. The legal process moved steadily, though never quickly enough to be finished in a single sweep. There were always more papers to be reviewed, more agreements to be adjusted. She found herself growing accustomed to the sight of her own name written in formal script, always paired with the title that had once felt like an ill-fitting garment. Soon it would be gone from her, and she wondered whether its absence would feel like a loss or a lightening. When at last the final documents were signed, it was done in a quiet room with a single window overlooking the gardens. The Duke was there, his manner unchanged, his voice even. There was no ceremony, no outward acknowledgement of the moment's weight. The solicitor gathered the papers into a leather case, and the sound of the clasp closing was the only sharp note in the room. They rose, exchanged a few final words, and left by different doors. That evening, alone in her rooms, Consuelo removed the ring she had worn for years. It left a pale band of skin on her finger, a mark that felt at once delicate and enduring. She turned it in her hand for a long time, watching how the candlelight caught on the gold, before placing it in a small box and closing the lid. The sound of it shutting was softer than the clasp on the solicitor's case, yet it seemed to echo just as far. The next morning, she awoke to a frost so thick it made the gardens shimmer as though dusted in silver. The air was still, the sky pale, and for the first time in many years, there was no schedule set for her day that belonged to the life she had just left. She dressed slowly, without the urgency of appointments, and walked down into the gardens. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, each step leaving a clear mark in the frost. She paused by the copper beech, its bare branches reaching upward, and placed her hand against its cold, rough bark. The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from a distant chimney. She stood there for a while, feeling the air on her face, the absence of the ring on her hand, and the quiet space opening before her. Whatever lay ahead was not yet known, but the path to it had begun here, in this still morning, with the formal untying of a knot that had bound her for so long. The bare hand, cool in the winter air, lingered against the rough bark of the copper beech before falling back to her side. That absence, the lightness where the ring had once rested, was not something she noticed constantly, but it would return at unexpected moments, like the sudden lifting of a long-worn weight. In the weeks that followed, the rooms of Blenheim no longer seemed to hold her in the same way. They were spaces she moved through rather than inhabited, their grandeur no longer tethered to any sense of belonging. Letters arrived from friends in London and Paris, speaking of changes in the world beyond the estate, of gatherings more intimate and free, of a kind of life that felt further from duty and closer to choice. It was in Paris, in the warmth of a salon filled with conversation and the scent of violets in glass bowls, that she met Jacques Balsan again. They had known each other before. His life woven between the aerodromes and the society drawing rooms, his manner carrying a lightness that seemed untouched by the heavy structures she had lived within. He had the kind of ease that comes from knowing the limits one is willing to accept and the courage to ignore the rest. With him, she found no rehearsed politeness, masking unspoken distances. His words, even when few, were offered without calculation. Their time together unfolded without the careful orchestration she had known in her first marriage. There were walks along the Seine in the soft light of late afternoon, conversations that lingered over coffee until the street lamps burned low, and quiet journeys into the countryside where the air smelled faintly of earth and rain. It was a pace entirely different from the measured days at Blenheim, less bound to the ticking of clocks and the turn of seasons dictated by obligation, more attuned to the shifting of weather, the mood of a morning, the simple decision to follow one path rather than another. In time they married, not with the spectacle of her first wedding, but in a ceremony whose intimacy felt truer to the life they wished to share. There were no vast aisles, no heavy train of silk, no watchful eyes of society's uppermost tier. Instead, there was the scent of fresh flowers from the market that morning, the quiet murmur of a few close friends, and the knowledge, rare and steady, that the choice had been entirely hers. They settled for a time in France, in a house near the coast where the air was sharp with salt and the gulls wheeled above the rocky inlets. The sea lay always in view, its moods shifting from glassy calm to wild unrest, a presence that seemed to echo the rhythms of life itself. She found in its constancy a kind of freedom. It asked nothing of her but to observe, to walk its edge, to feel the wind on her face and the grit of sand underfoot. The days there began simply. Mornings brought the pale light over the water, filtering through the curtains and painting the room in muted gold. She would walk into the village, greeting the baker, the florist, the women arranging baskets of vegetables outside their shops. The exchanges were brief but warm, built on the kind of recognition that grows quietly between people who cross paths daily. In the afternoon, she might write at the small desk by the window, or read in the garden where the scent of rosemary carried on the breeze. Jacques' work often took him into the air, his love of aviation, a thread that had run through his life for years. She would watch him from the ground as his plane rose, a small silver shape against the vastness, until it disappeared into the light. There was no unease in those moments, only the awareness that each of them carried their own pursuits, and that their life together was not a merging into sameness, but a meeting of distinct paths. Visitors came now and then, friends from Paris, acquaintances from abroad, bringing with them news of the changing world. The war had left its marks, some visible, some not, and in their conversations there was often a trace of the past's shadow. Yet here, in this place by the sea, the pace of life seemed to soften those edges. Evenings were marked by the sound of waves breaking against the shore, the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney, the lamplight pooling warmly on the pages of an open book. Sometimes, walking along the cliff paths, she would think of the girl who had once stood behind the locked gate of her mother's garden, looking out at a world she could not reach. She would think, too, of the young woman who had walked the long aisle of St. Thomas Church, her hands heavy with roses, her eyes fixed on a future chosen for her. Those selves were still hers, woven into her memory, but they no longer bound her. Here the horizon was open, and the road to it belonged to her steps alone. One autumn evening, as the tide was going out, she and Jacques walked along the wet sand, their reflection stretched in the shallow pools left by the retreating water. The wind was mild, the air carrying the faint scent of kelp and salt. They spoke little, their conversation taking the form of pauses, glances, the shared rhythm of walking side by side. Ahead, the sky was deepening toward twilight, the first stars just visible above the darkening line of the sea. When they returned to the house, the lamps were already lit, casting a soft glow through the windows. Inside, the table was set simply, the scent of bread and herbs drifting from the kitchen. As they sat down to eat, the sound of the waves was still faintly audible through the open window, a reminder that the world beyond their walls moved in its own time. That night, before sleep, she stood at the window and looked out toward the dark water. The horizon was invisible now, but she knew it was there, as constant as the tide. She thought of all the places it touched, all the shores she had crossed to come to this one, and felt a quiet certainty that, for now, she had reached a place worth staying. The salt-tinged air drifted in through the open shutters each morning, carrying with it the distant cry of gulls and the faint murmur of waves breaking against the rocky shore. In these early hours, the world felt unhurried, as if the sea itself had granted a reprieve from the passing of time. The days in France unfolded without the sharp edges of expectation. Instead, they curved gently, like the winding lanes that led from the house to the village and beyond to fields of pale green and gold. The garden became her favored place, a patchwork of lavender, rosemary, and climbing roses that flourished in the mild coastal air. Here, the paths were not laid out in rigid symmetry, but wandered as they pleased, turning unexpectedly toward a shaded bench or a view of the sea framed between cypress trees. She tended it herself more often than not, her hands in the earth, the scent of the plants clinging to her skin long after she had finished. The work was unremarkable to any passerby, but to her it felt like an act of quiet restoration. Each trimmed stem and turned patch of soil, a conversation with something that asked for nothing but care. In the afternoons, she would often walk to the village. The church bells marked the hours in tones that seemed to belong as much to the air as to the stone tower from which they rang. She came to know the rhythm of the place, the fishermen mending their nets along the quay, the children racing one another down the cobbled streets, the shopkeepers arranging their goods with the same precision each morning. Faces became familiar, greetings warm without being intrusive. Here, she was not a duchess, not a name printed in society pages, but simply Madame Balsan, a neighbor among neighbors. Art found its way into her life again, not in the form of grand commissions or public galleries, but in the sketches she made of the garden, of the curve of the bay, of the market stalls laden with figs and olives. Sometimes she would take the train inland to a nearby town known for its artists, wandering the small studios and speaking with painters who worked with the windows open to let in the scent of the fields. Their work bore none of the restraint of the portraits at Blenheim. It was vibrant, immediate, shaped by the light of the present moment rather than the weight of heritage. In the quiet of the evenings when the sky turned a deep blue and the first stars appeared above the horizon, she would sit by the window with a book, the lamplight pooling around her. Jacques might be in another room, reading his own paper or making notes for some project, but the sense of companionship between them was unspoken and steady. There was no need to fill every silence, no compulsion to perform for one another. The house seemed to breathe easily in this balance, yet even in such peace, the past did not disappear. At odd moments, the sound of the church bells would carry her back to other bells, other mornings when the chime had announced a day filled with expectation and duty. A certain quality of light through the shutters could recall the pale sun falling across her desk at Blenheim. These memories did not disturb her so much as remind her that life, no matter how far it travels, carries its earlier chapters folded quietly within it. Letters arrived from America, from old friends and a few remaining ties to her family. Some spoke of changes in New York, of new buildings rising where familiar ones had stood, of the shifting fortunes of families who had once seemed unassailable. Others carried news of those she had known in England, some still within the same circles, others having slipped quietly away. She answered them all in turn, her words polite and measured, yet written in the awareness that she no longer moved within those worlds except as a faint echo. There were visitors, of course. Friends from Paris, acquaintances from years past who found themselves traveling near enough to call. They would remark on the quiet beauty of the place, on the ease of life here, and sometimes on the change they perceived in her. She would smile, offer them coffee or wine, and lead them through the garden, letting them see the view of the sea from the shaded bench beneath the cypress. What she did not say, but sometimes thought, was that the change was not in her alone, but in the absence of the constraints that had once defined her days. One late summer afternoon, as the cicadas droned in the heat, she sat in the garden with a letter she had begun many times but never finished. It was not meant for anyone she could send it to. It was, instead, addressed to the selves she had been. She wrote to the girl in her mother's house, to the young woman walking the aisle in St. Thomas Church, to the Duchess moving through the echoing halls of Blenheim. She told them of the garden, of the sea, of the mornings unshaped by another's schedule. She told them that there were paths beyond the ones laid out for them, though they might not be visible until the time was right to walk them. When she set the letter aside, unfinished, the light had begun to change. The bells from the village church rang for vespers, their sound carrying clearly through the warm air. She listened until the last note faded, then rose to gather the cut stems she had left in the shade. The scent of rosemary rose as she brushed against it, mingling with the faint salt on the breeze. That evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, the water turned to a sheet of gold, its surface broken only by the slow arc of a gull in flight. She watched until the last of the light slipped away, leaving the garden in shadow. The air cooled, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. Before the village settled into its evening quiet, she closed the shutters, the faint scent of the sea still clinging to her, and felt the peace of the place settle around her once more, like a well-worn garment chosen for its comfort rather than its appearance. The unfinished letter lay on her desk for several days, its pages turned slightly at the corners by the coastal breeze that slipped in through the half-open shutters. She had placed a paperweight over it, not to keep it from flying away, but to remind herself it was still there, unresolved, waiting. Each time she passed the desk, her eyes would fall on the slanted lines of her handwriting, and something in her hesitated. It was not reluctance so much as the awareness that words, once set down, have a way of opening rooms in the mind that cannot be easily closed again. It was around this time that the suggestion came, quietly, almost in passing, from a friend visiting from Paris, that she should write her own story. Not in fragments addressed to past versions of herself, but as a full account, a gathering of the years that had shaped her, from the Fifth Avenue garden to the halls of Blenheim, from the locked gates of childhood to the open horizons of the French coast. At first she had smiled at the idea, imagining the inevitable curiosity it might stir in those who once read about her in the society pages. But that night, long after the house had gone still, she found herself turning the notion over with more seriousness. There was, after all, a truth to be told, not the truth as others had written it, through the lenses of gossip columns or the quiet distortions of polite conversation, but the one she herself had carried silently for decades. It would not be a work of scandal or accusation. She had no desire to strip the past of its dignity. Rather, it would be a record of how a life can be shaped by forces both chosen and unchosen, and how one might step beyond them. The following week, she cleared a space on the desk, placing there only a stack of clean paper, a fountain pen, and the small inkwell she had carried with her from Blenheim, a familiar object in a place that had otherwise shed much of her former life. She began in the morning, the light spilling across the desk and the scent of the garden drifting in from the open shutters. The first lines came slowly, not because she did not know what to write, but because she was listening for the voice in which to say it. She found it not in the language of grandeur, but in the steady cadence of recollection. The words were plain, the sentences unhurried. She wrote of her mother, of the garden she could see but not enter without permission, of the lessons in posture, speech, and silence that had prepared her for a future she had not chosen. She wrote of the man she had loved before her marriage, and of the letter she had kept unopened on her desk in New York. She described the Atlantic crossing, the mist rising over Blenheim, the echo of her own footsteps in corridors where her voice never seemed to belong. The days took on a new rhythm. Mornings were for writing, afternoons for the garden or the village. The sound of her pen on paper became as familiar as the ringing of the church bells, a private measure of time within the greater turning of the hours. Now and then Jacques would pause at the door, his hand resting lightly on the frame, asking if she wished for tea. He never asked what she was writing, only smiled when she said she was making progress. Inevitably, certain passages brought her to a halt. The memory of her wedding day returned with the scent of white roses in her mind, their perfume almost cloying in its heaviness. She paused over the description of her first winter at Blenheim, unsure how much of the loneliness to put into words. There were events she could recount easily in their outward form, yet which resisted the weight of her inner experience. Those she left for later, trusting that the right words would come if she waited. At times, the act of writing seemed to summon the past into the room. She would look up from the page and half expect to see a younger version of herself standing by the window, her gown sweeping the floor, her hands clasped in a gesture of composure that cost more effort than it appeared. Other times, the past felt far away, like a portrait hanging in another house, its colors fading at the edges. Both sensations had their own kind of truth, and she let them alternate as they wished. The manuscript began to grow, its pages stacked neatly in a box she kept close at hand. There was a satisfaction in seeing the pile increase, in knowing that each sheet carried a piece of her that had previously existed only in memory. She thought of it as both a record and a release, an offering to the self who had endured those years, and to anyone who might one day read them and see in them a reflection of their own quiet battles. By the time autumn came again, the air crisp with the scent of wood smoke and the sea turning a deeper shade of blue, she had filled more than half the box. The work was not without its fatigue. Some days the words felt heavy, each one requiring her to walk a corridor of memory she would rather leave dark. Yet there was also a lightness in setting them down, in knowing that the story was becoming hers in a way it had not been when others told it for her. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows of the cypress trees stretched across the garden, she sat back from the desk and read through the pages she had written so far. The voices of her past moved through them, the stern directives of her mother, the measured tones of the Duke, the warmth of friends whose names no longer appeared in the newspapers but lived on in her memory. She realized that in writing them, she had not only reclaimed her story but also softened it, as if the act of setting it down had allowed her to hold its weight more gently. That evening, she left the shutters open to let in the cool air, the pages resting neatly in their box. From the village came the faint sound of the church bells, their notes falling in a pattern she knew by heart. She thought of the work still ahead, the unwritten chapters, the decisions about what to leave in shadow and what to bring into the light. The pen lay ready on the desk, and in the fading glow its dark lacquer seemed to catch the reflection of the sea beyond the garden. Somewhere in that reflection lay the rest of the story, waiting. The pen lay on the desk, its nib dark with the residue of the morning's work, and beside it the inkwell reflected a dull oval of light from the afternoon sky. The faint scent of ink lingered in the air, mingling with the sharper note of the sea breeze that pressed occasionally against the open shutters. It was in these quiet hours, when the garden lay still and the village bells had not yet marked the hour, that she began to consider the question she had avoided since the first page. How much of what she was writing was memory, and how much had already become something else? Memory, she thought, was like the tide, faithful in its return, yet never bringing back the shoreline exactly as it had been. Each visit reshaped the edges, smoothed certain stones while uncovering others. She would write a scene as she recalled it, the color of the dress she wore, the way the light fell across a room, and then, days later, some detail would emerge from the shadows of recollection, altering the balance. Was the sky over St. Thomas that day pale with mist or bright with a brittle winter sun? Did her mother's hand tighten on her arm before they entered, or only in the moment they stepped into the aisle? There were larger uncertainties, too, the tone of a voice, the meaning of a glance. Such things could be remembered in the shape of feeling without ever knowing for certain if they had been intended. She found herself pausing over these moments, her pen lifted, aware that her choice of words could turn a kindness into indifference, or an indifference into a slight. Even silence, she realized, was open to invention once one began to write it down. Some passages felt as clear as the present moment. The letter she had left unopened on her desk in New York, the sound of the Atlantic against the hull of the ship, the flicker of a candle in Blenheim's drafty halls. Others resisted her, dissolving into impressions rather than events. She wondered if this was the mind's way of guarding itself, of letting certain rooms grow dim so that their contents could not be examined too sharply. One afternoon, after a long stretch of work, she opened the box where the manuscript pages were kept and ran her hand lightly over the top stack. The paper was warm from the sun falling through the shutters, and for a moment she imagined the words themselves absorbing that warmth. They were hers, yet they no longer belonged entirely to the past. They had been shaped by the present self, the one who chose which details to keep, which to alter, which to omit altogether. It was not dishonesty, she told herself, but the nature of storytelling. Even the most faithful account was a kind of arrangement, a pattern chosen from the raw fabric of days lived. The mind did not store life as a series of perfect images, but as fragments stitched together by meaning, and meaning changed over time. That evening, as the sky deepened and the lamplight pooled across the desk, she came across something she had not looked at in years, a small flattened violet pressed between the pages of a book. The petals had faded to a soft grayish blue, their edges brittle, the stem as thin as a thread. She could not remember where she had picked it or whether it had been given to her, though the fact that she had kept it suggested it once carried significance. Holding it now, she found herself inventing possible origins. Perhaps it had been from the garden of her youth, plucked on a day when the air smelled of rain. Perhaps it had been tucked into a letter she never answered. The truth, if she had ever known it, had slipped away, leaving only the object and the space for a story. She placed the violet on the desk and looked at it for a long while. It seemed a perfect emblem of her work, something preserved yet altered by time, something whose meaning might change depending on the light in which it was seen. She considered writing about it, then decided it was enough to keep it nearby as she worked, a reminder that memory and invention were often indistinguishable once the years had passed. On the following morning, she wrote with a different kind of ease. She allowed herself to admit on the page when she was uncertain, to leave open spaces where the truth might have been one thing or another. She began to see the book not as a final account, but as a conversation between who she had been and who she was now, between fact and the way the heart recalls it. In this way, the work felt lighter, less bound to the impossible task of exactness. From the garden below, the scent of rosemary drifted upward, carried on the breeze. She heard the faint sound of a cart in the lane, the creak of its wheels over the stones, and somewhere in the distance the first toll of the midday bell. She set down her pen and looked again at the pressed violet, lying in the thin pool of sunlight on the desk. Its color was almost gone, yet its shape remained, delicate and whole. It struck her then that perhaps this was the best one could hope for in telling a life, not to preserve every color exactly as it once was, but to keep the shape of it intact so that it might still be recognized, still be held in the hand without crumbling entirely. She returned to her writing, the violet just within reach, its shadow barely visible against the pale wood. The words came steadily now, shaped not only by what she remembered, but also by what she was willing to imagine. The two flowing together like currents, meeting in the same tide. The pressed violet lay on the desk for many days, a small, steady companion to the work of writing. Then one afternoon, as she moved a stack of papers to reach for it, the fragile petals gave way beneath her fingers. They crumbled into a fine, grayish dust that clung to her skin before slipping soundlessly to the surface of the desk. She brushed it gently into her palm, surprised by how little remained, and carried it to the open window. The breeze lifted it almost at once, scattering it into the garden below, where it vanished among the rosemary and lavender without trace. That quiet dispersal seemed to open another room in her thoughts, one she had been passing by without entering. It was the room of legacy, of the names and fortunes that had preceded her, of the lives they had shaped in both visible and invisible ways. The violet's dust was gone, but the portraits of her family remained, painted in oils that had outlasted lifetimes, their frames dark with age and guilt. They hung still in houses she no longer inhabited, their expressions unchanged, their gaze as steady as when she was a child looking up at them from a distance. She remembered walking once, as a young girl, through the long gallery of her parents' house, her mother's voice behind her recounting the names and virtues of each figure on the wall. The men were described in terms of achievements, railroads built, fortunes doubled, influence expanded. The women were spoken of as beauties, as hostesses, as the mothers of heirs. The air in that gallery had felt heavy, as though every painted face added another invisible weight to the one she already carried. At Blenheim, too, there had been portraits, generations of Marlboroughs in uniforms and gowns, each holding their pose in the unending stillness of the canvas. Some were accompanied by coats of arms and Latin mottos, others by small plaques noting titles and dates. To walk those halls was to move through a lineage made solid in pigment and varnish, a lineage into which she had been placed like a figure in an inherited frame. Yet in France, in the smaller house by the sea, the walls held no such watchful company. Here, the rooms were lined with watercolors of the coastline, sketches of the garden, and a few photographs of friends whose laughter she could still remember. There was no formal gallery to pass through each morning, no reminder that one's life might one day be reduced to an inscription beneath a portrait. Still, the legacy was there, carried not in the walls, but in the name, in the knowledge of the fortune that had once made her mother's ambitions possible, in the memory of the gates and rooms and titles that had shaped her youth. It was not a weight that pressed on her daily life anymore, but it was one she could never fully set down. The Vanderbilt name, like the Marlborough title, belonged to a particular chapter of the Gilded Age, and she, whether she wished it or not, was part of its story. As she wrote, she began to see how that legacy had been both anchor and chain. It had opened doors to places most would never see, yet it had also dictated the path she was expected to take once inside them. The wealth had been immense, but it had come with rules about whom to speak to, what to wear, where to be seen, and most of all, whom to marry. The weight of those rules had been so constant that it was easy in her early years to mistake them for the natural order of things. Now, years removed, she could see the machinery more clearly, how the fortunes of one generation were secured by the alliances of the next, how beauty and youth were treated as assets to be exchanged, how the public image of a family could outweigh the private happiness of its members. She thought of her mother's drawing room, with its carefully arranged invitations and its conversations conducted as though the outcome of each were a matter of strategy. She thought of herself at 18, seated on the edge of a chair in a gown chosen for the way it caught the light, listening to her future discussed as though she were not in the room at all. The pressed violet had turned to dust in her hand, but the portraits would remain long after her own photograph faded. Perhaps, she thought, that was the true nature of legacy. Not the preservation of the individual, but the endurance of the structure they had inhabited. In that sense, she had fulfilled her part in it, even as she had stepped away from its center. One evening, after a day spent writing of those earlier years, she walked down to the sea. The tide was low and the sand was damp and firm beneath her feet. She thought of the countless steps taken here by people whose names had never been recorded, whose lives had left no portraits, yet whose existence was every bit as real as those who hung in gilded frames. The wind carried the scent of salt and the faint cry of a gull. The waves moved with their own unbroken rhythm, indifferent to the legacies of railroads or palaces. She stood there until the light began to fade, the sea turning from silver to deep gray. Somewhere behind her, the church bells marked the hour, their sound softened by the distance. She turned back toward the house, its windows just beginning to glow in the dusk. Inside, the pages she had written waited in their box, each one an attempt to shape her own account before others could shape it for her. That night, as she closed the shutters, she thought again of the violet's dust and the portrait's unchanging faces. One had vanished into the air, leaving no trace but memory. The other would endure for centuries. Perhaps her life was somewhere between the two, partly dust, partly paint, partly the space where the light catches for just a moment before moving on. The memory of the portraits lingered into the next morning, but it was the sound of the window panes that pulled her into the present. A wind had come in from the sea, rattling the old glass in its frame and sending thin threads of chill air into the room. She rose to draw the shutters more tightly and for a moment stood looking out at the garden, the rosemary and lavender swaying under the pale autumn sun. The light was softer now, as if it carried the knowledge that its strength would soon diminish. In these years, the pace of life had settled into something quieter than she could have once imagined, yet more fully lived. There were no lists of duties waiting on her desk each morning, no schedules determined by a household's formal needs. She woke when the light filled the room, dressed in warmth against the season, and chose the day's shape as one might choose the course of a walk. Sometimes it led to the village for bread and coffee, sometimes to the garden with shears in hand, sometimes only to the chair by the window where a book lay open beside a cooling cup of tea. Letters still arrived, though fewer now, and she read them slowly, holding each one in her lap for a moment before unfolding it. Friends wrote of their children grown and moved away, of the illnesses they managed, of the small joys they found in daily rituals. These letters carried the same honesty as the sea outside her window. Each wave came as it would, unhurried, unhidden. She replied with her own news, the state of the garden, the changing weather, the visits from neighbors who stopped to leave figs or flowers on the kitchen table. Jacques' presence was a steady comfort, though their days often moved in parallel rather than entwined. He had his own pursuits, his own circles, but their evenings were shared. Simple meals, a bottle of wine, the slow unwinding of conversation that wandered from present to past and back again. They had learned, over the years, the art of being together without the need to constantly fill the air with words. The house seemed to mirror their rhythm. In summer, it opened itself wide to the breezes, the scent of the garden moving through its rooms. In winter, it drew inward, the fires banked high, the sound of the wind outside softened by the thickness of its walls. The seasons came and went with a kind of mutual understanding, and she found herself measuring time less by the calendar than by the color of the light on the water, the first call of the swallows, the last bloom of the roses. Occasionally, she would take out the box of manuscript pages and read a section at random. Some parts felt as though they had been written by another hand entirely, their tone more distant than she remembered. Others brought her back instantly to the moment they described: the rustle of silk on the morning of her wedding, the creak of a door closing somewhere unseen in Blenheim, the scent of ink in her childhood bedroom. She would linger over these passages, not to change them, but to acknowledge their place in the long arc of her life. Visitors came less often now, though those who did were received with warmth. Friends from earlier years would remark on the quiet beauty of the place, on how it seemed to hold its own time apart from the world's haste. Some would stay for several days, and she took pleasure in showing them the garden, the view of the sea from the cliff path, the market in the village square where the stalls were still arranged as they had been decades earlier. Often, these friends would leave with a small bouquet or a jar of preserved fruit, tokens of a visit that needed no grand gesture. As the years gathered, she noticed the way her attention shifted towards smaller details: the particular shade of gold in the leaves of the plane tree before they fell, the exact moment in the evening when the horizon dissolved into the sky, the first scent of wood smoke in the autumn air. These details seemed to anchor her more than any formal engagement ever had. They were not events to be recorded in society pages, but they carried their own significance, a private calendar known only to those who cared to notice. In the evenings, when the lamps were lit and the sea was no more than a dark presence beyond the garden, she sometimes thought of the many rooms she had inhabited in her life: the marble halls of her mother's house, the echoing galleries of Blenheim, the shaded drawing rooms of Paris. Each had been part of her, yet none held her as this place did. Here, there was no need to maintain a role, no gaze to meet or avoid. One late autumn afternoon, she stood at the garden gate watching a neighbor's child chase a red ball along the lane. The air was cool and faintly scented with burning leaves. She realized, as she leaned on the gate, that she could not remember the last time she had thought of herself in terms of title or lineage. Whatever weight those things had once carried had long since been set down. The wind rose again, moving through the cypress trees and rattling the shutters in their frames. She listened to it for a while before going inside, the warmth of the fire meeting her as she stepped into the sitting room. On the table lay a letter she had begun that morning, the ink still fresh where she had paused mid-sentence. She picked up the pen and continued, the words flowing easily, not because they were urgent, but because they belonged simply to the moment at hand. When she signed her name, the house was already deep in the quiet of evening. Outside, the wind softened, and the sound of the waves came clearer through the stillness. She sat for a while longer, hands resting in her lap, feeling the ease of a life that no longer needed to be proven or defended, only lived. The first snow came quietly, in the small hours before dawn, laying its pale, unbroken sheet over the garden and the fields beyond. When she drew the shutters back that morning, the world seemed hushed, the rosemary bushes rounded under their white caps. The stone path softened so completely that its edges disappeared. Even the sea, visible in a narrow frame between the cypress trees, appeared subdued, its surface dulled to the color of pewter. The air was still, and the sky hung low, as if holding the silence in place. She moved more slowly these days, her steps measured, her breath sometimes catching as she climbed the stairs. Yet there was no sense of urgency in her pace. Winter had brought with it a kind of permission to linger over the first cup of tea, to watch the light change across the frost, to sit with a book open but unread, her gaze wandering instead to the fire. The rhythm of the house adjusted itself to her needs without comment, the days beginning later and ending earlier, the spaces between activity filled with a quiet that felt less like absence and more like presence of another sort. Jacques kept a gentle watch, his manner unchanged, though she noticed how he seemed to appear more often in doorways, or linger a moment longer when leaving a room. They spoke often still, but their words were simpler now, the conversations like warm stones placed carefully between them. In the evenings, when the wind pressed against the shutters, they would sit near the fire, the lamplight low, the air scented with the faint resin of burning pine. Sometimes they would talk of the past, the people they had known, the journeys taken, but more often they spoke of the weather, of the garden's winter rest, of the sound of the sea that seemed nearer when the air was cold. Letters continued to arrive, though she found herself answering them less promptly. Her replies were shorter, the loops of her handwriting less precise, yet the act of holding the pen still felt grounding. A few of her correspondents wrote as though unaware of the season she was in, their news bright with the bustle of their own lives. Others seemed to sense it without being told, their words softer, their questions fewer. Outside, the snow held its shape for several days, the frost on the windows catching the pale sun in fleeting glints. She would watch the small birds hop along the garden wall, their dark forms quick against the white. The world beyond the garden seemed distant now, not unreachable, but receding into a kind of quiet she no longer felt the need to interrupt. The manuscript box remained on her desk, though she had not opened it in weeks. It was not that she had abandoned the work, but that the urgency of finishing it had eased. The pages already written were enough. They carried the arc of her story in their own way. Whether they would one day be read by many or by none no longer troubled her. The act of shaping them had been the truer completion. One afternoon, as the snow began to fall again, she sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in a shawl. The flakes came slowly, drifting down through the still air, each one vanishing as it touched the surface of the sea. She thought of the other winters she had known, the frozen fountains of her mother's garden, the frost-laced windows of Blenheim, the cold decks of the ship crossing the Atlantic. Those winters had all carried a sense of waiting for a change in season, a shift in circumstance, a passage towards something else. This winter felt different. There was no waiting, only a quiet inhabiting of the days as they were. In the evenings, she began to leave the shutters open a little longer, watching the twilight deepen until the lamps from the village flickered on one by one. The church bell would ring for vespers, its sound softened by the snow, and she would imagine the handful of parishioners moving toward the warm glow of the nave. The thought brought a kind of comfort, not for the ritual itself, but for the continuity it represented, a rhythm that would go on, with or without her. As January passed into February, the snow melted in patches, revealing the dark earth beneath. She would walk in the garden on the milder days, her steps leaving shallow prints in the damp ground. The rosemary released its scent when she brushed against it, as it always had, unchanged by the season. She found reassurance in that, small proof that the world's cycles held steady, even as her own slowed. One evening, as the fire burned low and the last of the day's light faded from the horizon, she extinguished the lamp beside her chair. The room filled with the softer glow of the embers, and the air seemed almost to hum with stillness. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth on her face, the weight of the shawl around her shoulders. The sound of the sea was faint but steady beyond the walls, and the scent of pine smoke lingered in the air. Somewhere in the quiet, she thought of a candle in a drafty hall at Blenheim, flickering stubbornly against the dark. She thought of the locked garden gate of her youth, of the unopened letter on her desk in New York, of the sound of a train whistle lost in autumn fog. These images came not as regrets, but as pages in a book she had long since learned by heart. The fire shifted, a single ember breaking and falling with a faint hiss. She opened her eyes once more, letting them rest on the slow curl of smoke rising into the dim air. It moved upward in a thin, wavering line, then dissolved, leaving the room in its quiet entirety. The last ember's smoke curled upward, thin and unhurried, before dissolving into the dimness above the hearth. For a long moment she watched the air where it had been, as if the wisp might reappear, only to realize it had gone as quietly as it came. That faint trace, visible for an instant and then vanished, reminded her of the way lives linger in memory, not always in the full shape of their days, but in a single gesture, a tone of voice, the scent of something once familiar. In the following mornings, the winter light came gently, the sky pale and even, the sea as calm as she had ever seen it. From her chair by the window, she could see the rosemary bushes recovering their green under the retreating snow, the first buds on the almond tree tightening against the cold. The air inside the house held the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, and each creak of the floorboards felt like the slow turning of a page. She found herself thinking less often in the long lines of a life lived, and more in the fragments that surfaced without bidding. The rustle of silk at her mother's side in a marble hallway, the weight of a white rose bouquet on a winter morning in New York, the low hum of a ship's engines as the Atlantic stretched out under a steel sky, the echo of her own footsteps through the corridors of Blenheim, the faint cry of a peacock in the dark gardens, the salt sting of the air in France, carried in through the open shutters of a summer morning. Each came without sequence, as if time itself had loosened its order. Visitors were rare now, though not absent. A neighbor might stop at the gate with a jar of honey. A friend from Paris might appear for a night or two, bringing the warmth of conversation and the quickened pace of voices not heard for months. When they left, the house would grow still again, but it no longer felt like emptiness. Stillness had become a kind of companion, one that allowed her to hear the smaller sounds, the shifting of the fire, the soft thud of the tide turning on the shore, the bell from the village marking the hour with an unhurried grace. Her manuscript remained in its box, complete enough to satisfy her, though not all of it had been polished into final form. Sometimes she thought she might return to it, to fill in a gap or soften a phrase, but more often she simply let it be. The work of telling her story had already done its part. It had drawn the past into the open air, allowed it to be seen and understood, at least by herself. Whether it would pass into other hands no longer seemed urgent. She had learned, in these later years, that not all legacies are meant to be public. Some are kept quietly, like pressed flowers in a drawer, known only to those who place them there. The days lengthened almost without her noticing, the late winter sun pushing its way higher in the sky. Yet she moved more slowly now, her steps deliberate, her body attuned to its own pace. She felt no need to reach further than the boundaries of the garden, no longing for distant journeys. The horizon she saw each day from her window was enough, a reminder that the world went on, whether or not she crossed its distances again. Sometimes, in the stillness before sleep, she would let her thoughts drift over the arc of her life, not as a continuous thread, but as a scatter of lights, each glowing briefly before fading into the dark. She thought of the forces that had shaped her, a mother's will, a marriage forged from ambition, the slow fracture of that union, the long Atlantic voyage to a place that had seemed more monument than home. She thought, too, of the quiet rebellions, letters kept hidden, walks taken alone, the unplanned kindnesses offered and received. What remained, she decided, was not the titles, the houses, or even the stories told in public. What remained were the smaller, less tangible things, the resilience to step beyond a role once thought permanent, the ability to see beauty in the unadorned, the grace to carry the past without letting it harden into bitterness. On one of the last afternoons before the spring, she sat in the garden, wrapped in a shawl against the lingering chill. The sea was calm, its color the pale blue of early thaw. From somewhere beyond the garden wall came the faint, rhythmic sound of a cart moving along the lane. She closed her eyes and let the sun rest on her face, feeling the warmth seep slowly into her skin. In that moment, she wondered, not for the first time, whether she had ever been truly free. Freedom, she thought, might not be the absence of expectation, but the quiet choice to live as one wishes within whatever walls remain. Perhaps the gates she had once dreamed of passing through had only led to other enclosures. Yet here, in this place, the space within them felt wide enough. The cart passed, its sound fading into the distance, and the air grew still again. She opened her eyes to the familiar shapes of the garden, to the rosemary and lavender, to the narrow view of the sea between the cypress trees. The tide was turning, though from here it could not be heard. She stayed until the shadows began to lengthen, then rose slowly and walked back toward the house, the path beneath her feet worn smooth by years of the same return. Inside, the room was warm with the glow of the late afternoon. She moved to the window once more, her reflection faint against the glass, and watched the horizon soften in the fading light. The sea was already slipping into evening, its surface darkening, its edges blurred by the gathering haze. In that mingling of water and air, she felt her own life's edges dissolve, not gone, but blending quietly into the larger expanse that would hold it when she was no longer here to tell it.